It is March 9th, 1945, 02:17 in the morning. On the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, where sulfur vents still leak their acrid breath into air already thick with cordite and death, a small group of Japanese soldiers moves through absolute darkness. There are 11 of them. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, 26 years old, a former schoolteacher from Osaka who once taught children to write poetry about cherry blossoms, leads them in single file through a network of tunnels that smell of sweat, infection, and something worse. They have not eaten in 4 days. Their last water came from licking condensation off tunnel walls 36 hours ago. 2 of the men can barely walk. One, Private Kenji Mori, carries a photograph of his infant daughter against his chest, a daughter born 3 months after he shipped out, a daughter he has never held. None of these men expect to survive the night. They have accepted this. What they have not accepted, what they cannot yet fathom, is what they will discover in the next 2 hours. They will stumble upon an American supply dump abandoned during a rapid advance. They will find food, water, medicine, and materials beyond their comprehension. And for reasons that would puzzle American commanders for decades, for reasons that speak to the very nature of ideological warfare, several of these starving men will choose death over the abundance before them. They will encounter not just supplies, but the physical evidence that everything they believed about their enemy, about their cause, about their certain victory, was a carefully constructed lie. The battle for Iwo Jima had begun 22 days earlier, on February 19th, 1945, when approximately 70,000 United States Marines stormed the black volcanic beaches of an island that measured barely 8 square miles. The Japanese garrison, numbering roughly 21,000 men under the command of Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, had spent months transforming the island into a fortress of unprecedented sophistication. 11 miles of tunnels connected over 1,500 rooms carved into volcanic rock. Artillery positions, concealed with geometric precision, created interlocking fields of fire that would turn the beaches into killing grounds. General Kuribayashi, a man who had traveled extensively in the United States before the war, who had visited Detroit's automobile factories and marveled at American industrial capacity, understood something his superiors in Tokyo refused to acknowledge. Japan could not win a war of attrition against American material wealth. His strategy, therefore, was not victory. It was delay. It was bleeding. It was making the Americans pay so dearly for every inch of volcanic ash that they might reconsider the invasion of the Japanese homeland. For the Japanese soldiers entombed in those tunnels, the battle had become something beyond conventional warfare. Supply lines from Japan had been severed weeks before the invasion. American submarines and aircraft had transformed the waters around Iwo Jima into a graveyard for Japanese shipping. The garrison had stockpiled provisions for approximately 60 days of combat, but those calculations had assumed a different kind of battle. Assumed Japanese soldiers would die quickly in glorious charges, not slowly in underground warrens. By early March, the mathematics of starvation had become inescapable. Rice rations, already reduced to a few tablespoons per day, ran out entirely for units cut off from the main tunnel network. Water, never abundant on an island without rivers or lakes, became more precious than ammunition. Men drank their own urine. They chewed leather straps from equipment. They consumed things that peacetime minds refused to contemplate. And through it all, they clung to beliefs that had been instilled in them since childhood, beliefs about Japanese spiritual superiority, about American weakness and decadence, about the inevitable triumph of Yamato spirit over Western materialism. What Sergeant Yamamoto and his men believed about Americans had been carefully constructed over years of state propaganda. They had been taught that Americans were soft, corrupted by luxury, incapable of enduring hardship. Japanese military education emphasized that American soldiers would break under pressure because they fought for money, while Japanese soldiers fought for the divine emperor. Popular literature depicted Americans as physically large but spiritually empty, as cowardly individualists who would flee rather than sacrifice for their comrades. The concept of yokusai, the shattering of the jewel, meaning honorable death rather than surrender, existed precisely because Japanese ideology could not accommodate the possibility of defeat against such supposedly inferior opponents. A true Japanese soldier would never surrender. A true Japanese soldier would take 10 enemies with him into death. A true Japanese soldier would rather die than face the shame of capture, because capture itself was evidence of spiritual failure. These were not merely ideas to men like Sergeant Yamamoto. They were the architecture of identity itself, the psychological foundation upon which everything else rested. The American supply dump they discovered at approximately 0430 that morning had been established 2 days earlier during a rapid marine advance toward the northern plateau. A logistics unit had cached supplies in a natural volcanic depression, intending to retrieve them within hours. But a Japanese counterattack had temporarily pushed back the American lines, and the supply point had been abandoned in the chaos. What Sergeant Yamamoto's patrol found, therefore, was not a carefully guarded position but an unattended treasure, or from their perspective, an incomprehensible nightmare made manifest. The first man to reach the supplies was Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, a farmer's son from Nagasaki who had celebrated his 19th birthday 3 weeks earlier in a tunnel so cramped he could not stand upright. According to testimony gathered from the 2 survivors of this patrol who were later captured, Tanaka stopped so suddenly that the man behind him stumbled. He stood motionless. He made a sound that was not quite a word, and then he began to weep. They found cases of K-rations stacked in quantities that seemed impossible. They found canned fruit, peaches and pears preserved in sweet syrup, luxuries that most of these men had not tasted since childhood. They found chocolate bars by the dozens, wrapped in packaging that featured English words none of them could read. They found medical supplies, morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, clean bandages in sterile wrappings, plasma containers with instructions printed in neat American typography. They found cigarettes, cartons of Chesterfields and Lucky Strikes, each carton containing more tobacco than a Japanese soldier might see in 6 months of war. They found water purification tablets. They found insect repellent. They found small luxuries that revealed the texture of American military life, playing cards, chewing gum, toilet paper that was soft and white rather than the coarse brown sheets issued to Japanese forces. They found a photograph someone had dropped, showing a young Marine with his arm around a smiling woman beside an automobile so gleaming and new that it seemed like something from another planet. They found evidence, overwhelming and undeniable, that everything they had been told about American weakness was a lie. Private Mori, the young father with the photograph against his chest, later described the moment to American intelligence officers. His testimony, preserved in declassified documents at the National Archives, records his words through a translator. We understood then that we could not win. Not because we lacked courage. Because we lacked everything else. We had been told Americans were soft because they had too much. But we saw that they had too much because their country could make too much. We were fighting factories with prayers. We were fighting ships with spirit. And spirit, we learned that night, does not stop bullets. Spirit does not feed soldiers. Spirit does not give medicine to the wounded. We had been told that wanting things made men weak. But not wanting things had made us into ghosts. The psychological impact of this discovery cannot be overstated. Japanese military doctrine emphasized that spiritual strength would compensate for material deficiency. Soldiers were taught that the American reliance on comfort and supply represented a moral failing, evidence of a civilization that had lost its warrior soul. The implication was clear: endure enough hardship with sufficient purity of spirit, and victory would follow. Material disadvantage was, in this framework, almost desirable. It provided the adversity through which true martial character emerged. What the supply dump revealed was the catastrophic flaw in this reasoning. The Americans had not merely matched Japanese spiritual commitment with material abundance, they had rendered the entire equation meaningless. A Japanese soldier willing to die for his emperor still required food to march toward that death. Medicine did not care about ideology. A bullet fired from a rifle manufactured in an American factory killed just as certainly whether the target possessed superior spirit or not. Sergeant Yamamoto ordered his men to eat. According to survivor testimony, he had to repeat the order 3 times. Several men refused. Private Tanaka, who had wept upon discovery, sat apart from the others and would not touch the American food. When Sergeant Yamamoto approached him, Tanaka reportedly said, "If I eat this, I accept that they are stronger. If they are stronger, then everything is a lie. If everything is a lie, then my brother died for nothing. I cannot eat this and still be myself." Tanaka's brother had been killed at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier. The family had received a letter praising his glorious death, his contribution to certain victory. To eat the American chocolate in Tanaka's psychological framework was to retroactively invalidate that death, to transform sacrifice into waste. 3 of the 11 men made the decision that haunts historians to this day. They consumed small amounts of the American supplies, enough to taste abundance, enough to confirm the reality before them, and then they ended their own lives. Private Tanaka was among them. So was a corporal named Yoshida, whose first name was never recorded in surviving documents. The third was a young conscript whose identity remains unknown. He had been with the patrol for only 2 days, transferred from another unit that had been effectively annihilated. They did not perform traditional seppuku, which required implements and ritual they did not possess. They used their rifles. They died in a volcanic crater on an island 8,000 miles from home, surrounded by food they could not allow themselves to accept. Historians have struggled to classify these deaths. Were they suicides in the Western psychological sense? Were they acts of military honor following a code the men themselves had internalized? Were they, in some strange way, the final assertion of agency by men who felt every other choice had been stripped away? Professor Yoshimi Yoshiaki of Chuo University, one of Japan's foremost scholars of wartime military psychology, has written extensively on the phenomenon of what he terms ideological self-destruction, deaths that occur not from despair over physical circumstances, but from the collapse of the belief. Structures that made those circumstances bearable. For these soldiers, Yoshiaki notes in his 2003 work on Japanese military ideology, the physical body could endure extraordinary suffering as long as the suffering served a comprehensible purpose. When that purpose was revealed as hollow, the body's survival became not a victory but an accusation. To continue living was to admit that one had suffered for a lie. Death became the only defense against that admission. The surviving 8 men, including Sergeant Yamamoto, remained in the crater until dawn. They ate American rations, they treated wounds with American medicine, they smoked American cigarettes and drank American water, and spoke in whispers about things Japanese soldiers were not supposed to discuss. According to Private Mori, Sergeant Yamamoto said something that none of them recorded precisely, but all remembered in essence: that the emperor was still divine, that Japan was still sacred, that they would still fight and probably still die, but that they now understood they were fighting something larger than enemy soldiers. They were fighting American farms and factories. They were fighting a system that could deposit chocolate bars in a volcanic wasteland 8,000 miles from its source, while they starved in tunnels beneath the same rock. "We are not losing to men," Yamamoto allegedly said. "We are losing to a nation that has learned to make abundance into a weapon." 5 days later, American forces overran the position where the patrol had taken shelter. Sergeant Yamamoto was killed in the engagement. Of the 8 survivors of that night at the supply dump, only 2, Private Mori and 1 other soldier whose name is recorded as Ito, were taken alive. Both were wounded. Both were transported to prisoner of war facilities. Both lived to see the end of the war. Private Mori eventually returned to Japan in 1946 and was reunited with the daughter whose photograph he had carried through the tunnels of Iwo Jima. He never spoke publicly about the war, but his detailed testimony to American intelligence officers, given in the weeks after his capture, provides the primary source for reconstructing this incident. He died in 1987 in Yokohama. His daughter, now elderly, donated his wartime effects, including the original photograph, to the Iwo Jima Memorial Museum in 2015. The chocolate bars found in that supply dump were almost certainly Hershey's Ration D bars, a product specifically designed for military use and distributed by the millions throughout the Pacific Theater. The Hershey Company produced over 1 billion individual ration bars during the war, a number so large that it becomes abstract, loses its ability to convey meaning. But for 11 starving Japanese soldiers in a volcanic crater, for men who had been taught that American luxury was proof of American weakness, a single chocolate bar represented something that transcended nutrition. It represented industrial capacity. It represented logistical systems that could move cocoa from tropical plantations to Pennsylvania factories to Pacific Islands with mechanical precision. It represented a civilization that had solved, to a degree unimaginable in wartime Japan, the basic problem of feeding its soldiers while simultaneously producing the weapons to arm them, and the ships to transport them, and the fuel to power everything and still have enough left over for chocolate. That chocolate bar was a message, whether intended as such or not. The message read, "We can afford this." The message asked a question that Japanese ideology could not answer, can you? The phenomenon documented in this incident was not unique to Iwo Jima. Throughout the Pacific Theater, Japanese soldiers who encountered American material wealth frequently experienced psychological crises that their training had not prepared them to address. On Guadalcanal in 1942, starving Japanese troops overran an American supply depot and discovered stockpiles so vast that some reportedly believed it must be a trap. On Saipan in 1944, Japanese civilians who had been told that Americans would torture and rape them instead encountered soldiers offering food and medical care, a cognitive dissonance that contributed to the tragic mass suicides at Marpy Point. The pattern repeated across dozens of islands, in hundreds of individual encounters, Japanese soldiers meeting not the soft and corrupt enemy they expected, but an enemy whose very softness, whose abundance of food, medicine, and comfort was evidence of a strength against which spirit alone could not prevail. Perhaps what we find most haunting about the deaths in that volcanic crater is not their tragedy, but their logic. Private Tanaka and his 2 companions were not acting irrationally within their own framework of understanding. They had been given a choice between 2 deaths: the physical death of the body or the ideological death of the self. The abundance before them was not merely food, it was evidence. And evidence, once seen, cannot be unseen. They could have eaten, survived, been captured, and lived into a post-war Japan that would eventually prosper beyond anything their wartime selves could imagine. But they could not become the men who would do that while remaining the men they currently were. The chocolate required a transformation they could not perform, and so they chose the only death that allowed them to remain themselves. What this supply dump taught, what countless similar encounters throughout the war revealed, is that modern industrial warfare is won not only on battlefields, but in factories, on farms, in the complex systems that transform raw materials into the 10,000 items a modern army requires. Japanese soldiers possessed courage that American commanders themselves acknowledged with respect. Sometimes what they lacked was not spirit but steel, not determination but diesel, not willingness to die but the means to keep living while fighting. The war in the Pacific was, in this sense, decided long before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. It was decided in the decades of industrial development that allowed one nation to flood the Pacific with ships, planes, supplies, and yes, chocolate bars, while the other nation asked its soldiers to substitute spiritual purity for calories. We return now to that moment in the crater, to Private Maury sitting beside men he had known for days or months, eating food that tasted like surrender, watching 3 of his comrades choose a different path. The photograph of his daughter remains pressed against his chest. He will survive the night. He will survive the war. He will hold that daughter in his arms and watch her grow into a woman who will never know hunger, never know war, never know what it means to find your entire worldview shattered by a chocolate bar in a volcanic wasteland. He will carry the memory of that night for 42 years, speaking of it only once, to American intelligence officers who recorded his words in documents that would remain classified until 1978. And perhaps in the silence he kept for all those decades, in the things he never told his daughter or his grandchildren, we find the truest testimony to what happened in that crater. Some experiences defy language, not because they were too terrible, but because they were too true. The men who died that night died fighting a war they could not win against an enemy they did not understand. The men who lived carried forward a knowledge that changed everything. That ideology, however sincere, however fervently believed, cannot substitute for material reality. That a nation's strength is measured not only in the willingness of its sons to die, but in its capacity to keep them alive while fighting. That abundance, American abundance, the chocolate bars and white bread and soft toilet paper that Japanese propagandists mocked as evidence of weakness, was in fact evidence of something else entirely. It was evidence of a system that could produce miracles of logistics, that could deposit the taste of Pennsylvania in a sulfur-stinking crater in the Pacific, that could fight a war on 2 fronts across 2 oceans and still send its soldiers to battle with more supplies than their enemies could dream of capturing. The chocolate was not just chocolate, it was a nation. And in that volcanic crater, 11 starving men learned what that nation could do. The sun rises over Iwo Jima now as it rose then, indifferent to history, indifferent to the thousands who died beneath its light. The tunnels have mostly collapsed. The beaches, once black with volcanic ash and red with blood, host occasional visitors who come to remember. Somewhere in those 8 square miles, beneath rock and time, lie the remains of men who never returned home, Japanese and American both, enemies in life, equal now in death. And somewhere in the historical record, in declassified documents and fading testimonies, lives the story of 11 men who found abundance and could not bear what it told them about their world. They are not famous. They are not commemorated on monuments. They are footnotes in a war of footnotes, a war so vast that individual stories disappear into statistics, into aggregate numbers that tell the truth of scale but not the truth of experience. But perhaps their story matters precisely because it is small, because it happened in a crater rather than a command center, because it involved chocolate bars rather than aircraft carriers, because it reminds us that wars are fought not by nations but by men, and that men can be broken not only by bullets but by evidence, not only by enemies but by the collapse of everything they believed about those enemies. The men who died in that crater died defending something more personal than an island. They died defending the only version of reality in which their suffering made sense. And when that reality crumbled, they crumbled with it. We do not know if they were heroes or victims or simply men who reached a limit that others did not reach. We know only that they existed, that they suffered, that they made a choice, and that their choice speaks across decades to anyone who has ever confronted evidence that everything they believed was wrong. This is what the war taught. This is what the supply dump revealed. Not merely that America was stronger, but that a certain kind of strength, the strength of systems, of industry, of organization, of a society that could produce both soldiers and the endless supplies those soldiers required, would define the century to come. The Japanese soldiers who died on Iwo Jima were not defeated by American courage, though courage was present. They were defeated by American farms and factories, by American ships and logistics, by a civilization that had transformed abundance itself into the ultimate weapon of war. The chocolate bar was the message. The supply dump was the messenger. And the men who could not accept that message paid the price of their refusal in the only currency remaining to them. 80 years later, the story endures, not as triumph, not as tragedy, but as testimony. Testimony to the human cost of ideological warfare. Testimony to the moment when belief collides with evidence. Testimony to what happens when men discover that they have been lied to and must decide whether to live with that knowledge or die still believing. In the silence of that volcanic crater, in the darkness before dawn on March 9th, 1945, 11 men confronted a truth that chocolate bars had made undeniable. Some chose to live with that truth, some chose not to. And in that choice, in that specific and irreducible human moment, we find something that statistics cannot capture and monuments cannot commemorate: the weight of abundance and what it asks of those who encounter it without the means to answer.